Cool. Nice, recording, okay. Yeah, okay. I even made a whole new window for people so you guys want to see all of my terrible amounts of tabs. Well, defeats purpose if I share the desktop. Okay. Cool. Okay, I'm just coming through for you guys. Can you guys see like the exam review PowerPoint stuff? Cool, great. Just checking. Yeah, I can also share this PowerPoint with people if you want. So the first thing I really noticed in like the first chapter section was the stuff for ecosystem services. And that's just gonna be, I think, a really important concept to kind of like really understand in this class. And if you go into other environmental classes, I don't know if you are or not, but it's a really important concept. So it's just like ecosystem services are the aspects and like the services that nature provides people. And that'll be like kind of like free of charge. So like trees and grass just like outside, the services they are providing are like erosion prevention. So like when we have really big rains, like it's not going to just wash that away. So that's then protecting our streams. And then when our streams are protected, that's protecting our estuaries. When our estuary is protected, that's protecting our fish, which is therefore protecting our fishing industry. So like it's kind of all connected, these small things, and then that's all. So these services that we'll just get from the world around us. It saves a ton of money just from the fact of like, again, if you look at erosion, if you have a lot of trees, shrubs, grass, that's gonna be better for big flooding incidents than places that are just gonna be like in big cities. So like big cities, all the water doesn't have anywhere to soak up, and so it'll just run off. That's why you'll have so much like runoff water or just need a really big storm drain system because it just runs off and then it will like, you've all seen flooding pictures. Like you'll have these really big floods, but you'll still have that for like places with like lots of trees and grass, but you won't have it quite as much. So then like the damages that are saved because of those are there, that's going to be part of your ecosystem services just because that's saved. Does the ecosystem services kind of make sense? Because I can also keep going on. So another important idea is the tragedy of the commons. I think everyone got it on the quiz that we took on Wednesday, but I just kind of wanted to bring it back up because it's also another really important idea. Also just for economics, if you care about economics, also important for that. But it's just the idea of your, like a single common resource. And I think the example used in the PowerPoints were like cattle field. And if it's used by individuals just in their self-interest, that'll ultimately end up depleting the resource. And so therefore, like, you know, well, there needs to be regulations, and that's how you get into like regulations of like rangelands and stuff. A really good example of this that Brent hasn't already talked about, as far as I'm aware, is like our fisheries. So I pulled up this graph of the Atlantic cod fishery. And so this was just off the coast here, and cod was like the common like whitefish, like, you know, it's like kind of like you go eat tilapia like that. It used to just be cod. Like the only reason we eat tilapia is because we utterly destroyed the cod population. So if you look at this graph here, if you see it like 1992, because of overfishing, like by separate companies, like massively overfishing, cod population just, it collapsed. It would no longer was able to sustain itself, and we don't eat cod anymore because it's not there. And so like before that, it was like kind of seen as this resource, and we'll get into it with like frontier resources. I think it might actually be my next slide, but like it was like this cod resource, there's millions of these, like it's never gonna run out. And so then we're just like, okay, never gonna run out, let's just go. And then it did. And that's why we've moved on to like the tilapia. Not quite sure how those stocks are doing, but you know, but so like that's a really good idea of like the tragedy commons. So you can either think about like the cod industry, just fish, or you can also think about cattle, if that, whichever one works for you. But it's basically just self-interest for a resource And eventually that will be depleted unless something else is done. Yeah, so kind of what I was talking about with like cod, there's two different ways to really look. Well, there's more than two different ways to look at environmental ethics. Two ways to look at environmental ethics will be your frontier ethics, and then you're also your sustainable ethics. So the idea of frontier ethics is that like the natural resources, they are not finite. They were made to be consumed, and then you move on, and then you just kind of keep going with that. There's never going to be a point where you can't move on from something. And so that's really focusing on like the human needs. So a good example of that is fisheries. So like the cod, we consumed that resource, so we moved on to a different resource, the tilapia. It's like that's like a really good example of frontier ethics. It's just you use this, you move on. It's very anthropogenic, like you just really look at the human aspects, like, okay, how can I get, what can I get from this area? What can I get from this resource? I also have coal mining on here, just like if you think of like mountaintop removal or like strip mining, like you'll just take it off, don't necessarily do anything about it, and then you'll move on. So then another way you can look at it is sustainable ethics. It's kind of what it sounds like. It's the idea that natural resources are limited, therefore we need to take care of them. And they should be just taken into account just as much as like human needs should be taken into account. So it's really looking at like long-term human sustainability and environmental sustainability. So kind of like pairing those both together. Some of the general assumptions, like I was kind of saying, is like growth is unsustainable. There needs to be some kind of cap. Kind of like think about the carrying capacity of the land for like animals. It's like that, but applied to people. Like the growth needs to be controlled. There's limited resources, and like we are just as affected by the world around us as the environment is by us, and if not more so. So kind of breaking down sustainable ethics like a little bit more, there's even more to like ways we can look at this. So it'll be your anthropogenic. So that's just human priority use. If you guys go into any like conservation anything, you'll know that there was like, or yeah, no, but you'll learn. There is as the conservation and like green movement kind of happened, there was, you can see a shift. And so it started out with this anthropogenic idea. So like our national parks were created to control lumber. It was basically like, hey, we need to control lumber and conserve lumber for future generations. So let's make a national forest because then we can control the lumber. That's what it was originally made up for. And so that's the idea of like, okay, yeah, we need to contain these natural resources. So then let's maintain these resources for human consumption later down, like future generations as well as now. And then you can also go the biocentric route. And so that's kind of more like the national park side rather than national forest, but it's the idea of like all things in the natural world, like they're important to conserve regardless of how they can help humans. So it's the idea that the nature has this intrinsic value rather than instrumental value. So intrinsic is like, it has worth, it just has worth no matter what its use. It doesn't need a use, it has worth. But instrumental will be, well, how can this, like what use does it have for a purpose? So biocentric is that first one. Example that I saw he used in the PowerPoint, so I was going to highlight it again, is the Hetchy Valley. So that was the one where it's like, I think it was Los Angeles, but they like needed a new water source. And they're like, hey, how about here? But it was like this really beautiful valley and all this stuff. And so it had this big fight of like, are we actually going to build a reservoir here and flood this entire area or not? And so it actually was built and it did flood the entire area and it's a reservoir now. But so that's kind of like, that's more on the anthropogenic side, while the group that was fighting it was the biocentric side. And then I kind of popped up John Muir in the top of this. I don't know if you'll have to know about him. He was down like on the PowerPoint and I saw that he was kind of listed there. I think all you need to know is that John Muir, he was a really big name for conservation. Especially, I don't know if either of you have heard about the Sierra Club, but it's like it's like this one of the big like original green groups, and he was like the leader of it, and he led a lot of this stuff, and he like led the fight against making the Hetch Hetchy Valley and then kind of on. So all you know is he's kind of important for conservation. Other than that, I think you probably don't need to know more than that. I just know that PowerPoint didn't go in as detail, so I just thought I'd mention it a little bit. So I've talked with many people about like population, community, and ecosystems, and it's hard to remember sometimes what the difference is. And so I just kind of was like, these are 3 terms to like be at least familiar with. So your population is going to be a group of like organisms of the same species in the same area. So kind of like on this little thing, it's like all the fish. That's your population. Your community is going to be all the organisms in a specific area, whether that be animals or plants. It's going to be all of it. And then your ecosystem is going to be your community of organisms, but then also your like non-living things. So like your rocks, your more rocks, but like basically the things that aren't necessarily living. That's going to be your ecosystem, like everything then like that. Yeah, it's kind of, I guess one other way of thinking about it is it's kind of going up in a size each time. So you're like population, and then like you're adding things in for your community, and then you're adding more things in for your ecosystem. So like kind of like builds as you go up there. Another important thing is going to be your trophic levels of just kind of like understanding like how these relate to each other. So I just kind of have these like your producers, your consumers, and your decomposers on here. Just kind of like their roles. So producers will make food from inorganic materials. So that'll be your plants, your algae, basically things that use photosynthesis are going to be your producers. They produce. And then your consumers will be things that consume other living things. That'll be herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. They're all consuming. And then you have your decomposers, which will be breaking down dead things. So they're just not living when it happens usually. And then you'll also have different levels. So like on this graph, you'll have your primary consumer, but also your secondary consumer, and then at the top, so like third way, tertiary. And that's kind of just looking at like predators and prey. And just I guess just as it moves up the pyramid, that's the way that it increases rather than down. So like I can always see that like, oh, primary will be first because it's at the top because it's primary. It's like primary will be at the bottom if you're looking at the pyramid. So it just increases as it gets higher. So maybe like with height, think of number increasing if you're trying to, if you have to remember that. Another thing that I was looking at was your graphs and your curve lines. So your J curve will generally be like your population, and that'll be like your exponential growth line. Just like, I think the example in the PowerPoint was like flies. But like you get 2 flies together, they do what flies do, and then you have 60 million flies, and then you have more than 60 million flies. It's just, it'll just keep exponentially increasing. But then you'll get to your S curve, and this will be where like carrying capacity comes into this. So like, yeah, so your flies are increasing, but oh, well, okay, they ran out of food that they can actually feasibly eat. So like that's their carrying capacity right there. And so that's where your S curve comes in. Because like, you kind of look at it before it starts going off here, it does have like the shape of your exponential graph before it levels out. I also just put in K as your carrying capacity. It seems a very small detail to have to know, but like it's just the letter variable that's used for carrying capacity. If you ever have to look like at a carrying capacity equation or anything, just K will be your carrying capacity. And so then we kind of touched on it with like populations, but then your carrying capacity is how like what amount of animals or species area can actually contain. It can actually carry. So like, yes, I did just screenshot this off the PowerPoint, but it makes a good point with the moose. So, but like that line carrying across, that K, that is K. So that's the carrying capacity. So that's what the land can actually sustain. And so then when the moose go past that, they're all happy and they're like, oh, frick, I can't, there's nothing to eat. And so like that's when they'll have that die off and they'll go back down. And then they'll be like, hey, wait, there's more to eat now. And go back up, go back down, and just have this very cyclic cycle. Predator and prey interactions will also go with that. So like this is just the graph I found of this, but like, so as your populations of rabbits increase, your wolf population will increase with it because there's more for them to eat. And so then once they've successfully eaten, they'll have less to eat because they've killed a decent amount. And so the rabbit population will go down. And now because the rabbit population is down, the wolves won't have anything left to eat. And so then they'll go down. And so predator prey will also have this very cyclical interaction, and they'll just follow each other essentially. Just one will follow the other. I also grabbed some terms. Sorry, there's a lot of text on this slide, but I just found some terms that I thought would be generally important to at least be like aware of and familiar with. And I did talk, so like since this is open note, I really would just start the exam with all of the PowerPoints open and then just control F your way through. Just because like if you're at this question, it's like, does diversity mean this or this? You can be like, oh, I don't know. Control F diversity. And you're like, ah, gotcha. So like, but like that also takes time. So like if you can at least be like, have someone an idea, this could at least help you around. But so diversity will be your number of different species in an area. So like growing up, my house was very diverse because I had a snake, a gecko, cats, and a dog. So like that's very diverse. But your abundance will be your amount of individuals in a single species. So like I had one snake, but we had 5 cats. Like, you guys are learning a lot about my childhood pets. I wasn't expecting this to go this way. But like, so we had a big abundance of cats at my house, but a not very large abundance of snakes. And then you'll also have your generalists and you'll have your specialists. So your generalist will occupy a really broad ecological niche. And I realized I didn't put ecological niche on there, but that's really like how they'll function with it. An ecological niche will be how they function and within an environment. So like bees have a very specific niche that they'll apply to because they pollinate. They won't do much more besides that. But like, so like that's what they can do. So like raccoons though, like they go around, and if you look especially like at like eating habits, they'll have a very broad ecological niche. They'll scavenge, they'll kill things, they'll eat birds, they'll eat, not birds, but like they'll eat meat and they'll eat like fruits and stuff. Like, so they're very general. They kind of do whatever they want, raccoons. But you also have your specialists, which will have a really narrow ecological niche. And so that's kind of like pandas, some birds, like pandas because like they'll eat specific things. I also put birds down here because sometimes birds can be highly evolved to like one specific species of like pine cone, like because they'll have like really specific beaks. And so then they might be the only bird that's capable of spreading those seeds. And so then they'll have a very ecological, very narrow like niche. So then complexity is going to be your number of trophic levels. So like our trophic levels back here. And the number of species at each level. So like, can't use my childhood pets to illustrate this, but like if you have several, like if you'll have your producers, you'll have your primary, secondary, tertiary, have all of those levels, well then, okay, so how many species are actually at these levels? Maybe at your tertiary, you have owls, you have cougars, you have foxes, maybe that's it. Or maybe another one just has bears. Like that will be less in complexity just because there's less species at that specific level. And this kind of plays into the idea of then resilience. So resilience is the ability of an environment to really kind of bounce back after a disturbance. And so disturbance can be like human construction, a wildfire, a mudslide, hurricane. Any of that is a disturbance, anything that's out of the norm. And it's how so it's like how they can kind of return to form after these things have happened. So like if there is let's say there's a fire in the area and it burns a lot of stuff. Well, okay, so what's left? How many niches are still remaining? How can it kind of rebuild? Maybe one with only oak trees. Maybe if there's a field or some kind of forest with only oak trees, maybe that's completely burned. Well, oak trees have a really hard time coming back after a fire just because they're not made for that. And so it takes that area a long time to kind of build back because it has to start from like, has to have seeds flown in by birds, all this kind of stuff has to really rebuild slowly. But say it goes through this forest that has oak trees and it has some kinds of pine trees. And the pine trees are maybe adapted for the fire or they're harder to burn than the oak trees. And so when the fire goes through, there's still these trees remaining. And so then they can have, they can reseed better, they can have other organisms there better just because there's shelter there. So that's kind of like resilience. So the keystone species is, as long as you think of Yellowstone wolf, honestly, you'll probably be good with this. But it's a species whose impact is larger and then more influential, like what you would expect. So like the wolf was a keystone species because when it was removed, well, your elk population is controlled. And so they ate all the saplings and then they mess up the river and then the fish are messed up and so are the beavers and it just kind of keeps cascading down. So keystone species is similar to, it's exactly that. It's stuff that's things are really built around. They're really controlling one thing, but it's hard to really figure out what those species are until they're gone, honestly. Another idea is succession. So kind of going back to that idea of maybe the fire again, something goes through, everything's burned, or even just farmer sells his land and he's gonna, or a farmer's like, I'm gonna leave this part of my land and I'm just gonna let it grow however. And it turns back into a meadow. And so it's like, as it's recovering from being farmed or as it's recovering from being burned, it's the plants that'll come back. Which ones will come back first? So you'll have like your smaller, your shrubby stuff, and then eventually you start getting your saplings and your trees, and then you'll start getting these bigger trees and you'll get things underneath that. It's like that succession, how it builds on each other as it recovers from disturbance, really. And this appears to be the end of my PowerPoint. So yeah, I guess questions about what I talked about or other questions just in general?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there stuff going to be like from the textbook? Because I know the textbook also talked about like a few other things like that he didn't really talk about. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I definitely did not talk about all this stuff. I just went through and looked at like things that I thought would be really important. Rachel, you had Brent, I guess, the rest of the semester. What would you say his exams were like in terms of like the textbook? Because I've never actually taken an exam from him.
I don't remember there being honestly anything. If it was not talked about in the PowerPoints, it was not in the test. By the end, okay, this is really bad. Maybe I shouldn't say it's while it's recording, but like by the end of Earth Science, didn't really take a whole lot of stock in reading the textbook, and it was totally fine, actually. So if this is the same thing, I really wouldn't worry about it. Like I remember it just being really what he was talking about in class, in the PowerPoints, and on the quizzes. So yeah, you'll have to really look through them. I hope that's the same. I hope I don't steer you wrong.
Yeah, so I would say like I pulled out some stuff that I thought was like good to emphasize, I guess is the best way of saying it. But I would say definitely just like go over his PowerPoints then, because Rachel's taking more of his exams than I would. And it sounds like, and then I know the PowerPoints are especially the PowerPoints are definitely straight from the textbook. And so then if he's just going off the PowerPoints, I would just study the PowerPoints.
I couldn't believe how like the same, it is just straight out of the textbook. So like, it'll be okay.
It's really
Kendi, did you have another question? Because I'll ask one, but I didn't want to like, if you had more.
There's just like about the test. I don't know if you know. I was just gonna ask like if it's gonna be like the quizzes like multiple choice or if they're gonna be like short answer. And is it timed? I forget.
Yeah, I think it's timed. I think you have like an hour and a half. Let me double check for you. Oh no, can you guys see all my tabs now? Okay, good. I probably have 30 tabs right now. It's fine, it's fine. Yeah, so you're gonna have, so the exam is open from 12 a.m. until 11:59 tomorrow. You have to complete it in an hour and a half. And so it's timed. There's a mixture of multiple choice, true, false, matching, and short answer / essay questions. Open book policy. The one exam that I did look at for Earth Science, like earlier this semester, it seemed majority of it was multiple choice. And then there was like a handful of like short answer stuff, maybe like 4 or 5. And then like a few, I saw like one matching on that one, I think, and like a couple of true false. So I think majority of it's going to be multiple choice.
Yeah, there were no essays, unless my definition of an essay and his definition of an essay are different. There were just like, you know, write 4 to 5 sentences for like a question, and that was good enough. But yeah, not like a full-blown essay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was it.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. I was going through his study guide. I was able to like at least write or think about a definition for each of, you know, the things there, but there were a few. What in the world is a tolerance limit? Because I felt like, is that the same as like a carrying capacity? Is that just another word? I don't think I could find it, but maybe honestly, it might have been in the textbook and I just didn't pay that much attention to it.
Well, I think I saw it. Let me see if I think I remember seeing in the PowerPoint. And if I can, I'll pull it up real quick because then we can have like a visual before I start like rambling and everything. I'm prone to ramble. Yes, I guess I was tutoring for Earth Science, but I'm definitely much more comfortable with environmental science, so I'll probably ramble a lot more than I did earlier this semester.
I wouldn't call it rambling. You're just knowledgeable.
Okay, I am so sure. Okay, I remember seeing this. If I don't find it in the next like 30 seconds, I will just stop. but I'm pretty sure I saw it earlier because I remember deciding if I should put this in the PowerPoint or not. But they knew the end. Okay. Wait, what? Yeah, just gonna put those up. Okay, here. I'm sharing. I'm gonna stop share for a second. Okay. Okay, so your tolerance limit is kind of I don't know if this is kind of like this figure kind of is your tolerance limit. And it's kind of like where you can exist, really, if that makes sense. Like, so it's like, okay, a better way of describing this is I've misplaced this. Anyway, a better way of describing this is, I know since you can see it right now, is kind of like the ranges that a species can like tolerate or like live in. So like the example here is like butterflies, but if you kind of like think about this as in like temperature, think of it like temperature. So like this optimal range, say these butterflies' optimal range is like 80 degrees or something. So like they'll really be good here, they'll really reproduce, like they'll be great. But then once it starts getting colder, then there's that stress on them. They can't quite function as well. Maybe they can't keep warm. And then it gets even colder, and then that's intolerance. And like they're just not going to be there anymore, or they'll die, or like that's why their range doesn't make it to the Rockies or something. But then you also have like the opposite. And so like there's 80, but maybe they're at their range borders on like a desert, but they won't be in the desert because it's just really warm there. They can't regulate their body heat, so they just kind of boil and die. So like the two extremes are like their tolerance limit.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
That does. That does. I feel like all of these definitions are very similar with like these ones on this page, I mean, with just very minor details.
Yeah, I actually hadn't seen the study guides. This is the first time I'm looking at the study guide, so rip to that. Yeah, honestly, that's a lot of environmental things. They're like just slightly different.
Oh, I guess it's a common thing. Yeah, and that we'll figure it out. But yeah, that does make sense. So thank you for that. There was another one. I'm trying to look through. Oh, I know that this, I probably shouldn't be asking this. I now have gotten this lecture twice, but in regards to the scientific method, one of the concepts was like, to what degree of certainty can a hypothesis be tested? What is that? That the sense doesn't make any sense to me.
Where is this? Just so I can see. Is it at the very top?
On the concepts, like on the study guide, it's like the third one. Yeah, to what degree of certainty can a hypothesis be tested? I don't really know what that means. Meaning like, can you actually do it? Like if I said, oh, I want to experiment of something on the moon. Well, I'm not an astronaut, so I can't just hop on a spaceship and just go. Is that what he means? But that sounds really elementary.
I think what he's going for is the idea of like, can you prove it? It's like, no, you can't necessarily. I can do as many studies as I want on like, I don't know, my back screen, my desktop whatever screen is a zebra. So I can do as many studies as I want on like zebra, I don't know, interactions. And like I can have these hypotheses on that, but I can never quite prove it. Because proof means like that theory, like or a law, like it's like this is irreproachable, like this definitely happens. And then of course it just takes one study to disprove mine as well.
Right.
So it's like that. I think that's what he's going for, the degree of certainty. Like you can never quite prove like hard facts that this is correct, but you can be like, yeah, this is very likely and this is what we found. And so like this indicates that this is what's going on.
Okay, that does make sense. Yeah, the wording was just really, at least for me, just very bizarre. I was like,
yeah, honestly, it makes me think like statistics, and I'm like, I don't think we talk about statistics.
Wrong class. Yeah, and then my last one, it's back up at the terms. What's biotic potential? Again, I don't know if I could find that, but I probably wasn't looking that hard.
Okay. I don't remember seeing this in the PowerPoints, but it's like, let me see if I can find a good. Okay, I think this is an okay picture. I'm gonna stop sharing and reshare then. Okay, so like the one that I have pulled up here, so like biotic potential is kind of like going back to that J curve. It's like if there wasn't a carrying capacity, it's like all of the potential that that species or whatever has to reproduce and to be whatever it wants to aspire to be. But it has that pesky carrying capacity. So it can't quite, it's not there. So like that's kind of like what your biotic potential is. It's like whatever has the potential of being.
Oh, okay, that makes sense because it just said like biotic potential and there was the graph of like the fruit flies or whatever. And I was like, but there's no definition. Okay, that totally makes sense now. Yeah. So thank you. I think that is all the questions I have. I feel like I have had this class in 7th grade, in 10th grade, part of some other thing. Like I feel like most of these are going, I've heard this at least twice before in my life. So hopefully it'll come through tomorrow when we take the test. Be like, oh yes, I remember that from all the years of science.
I believe.
Yeah. But yeah, I think I'm good.
Yeah. How are you feeling, Kenzie?
Pretty good. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Well, I will be here for another 15 minutes, but if you guys are satisfied, that's fine. Or we can do other things as well.
All right, I'm gonna go then. Thank you.
Yeah.
See ya. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.